Good afternoon. The next panel has the topic Middle Manager's Role in the Culture of Compliance, which I think is a very important topic building off of several of the discussions we've had thus far, particularly with respect to some of the Justice Department issues around the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. The DOJ guidance, speaks to corporate culture and corporate compliance, but these are largely terms that are not well defined, and there are, various academic definitions of these terms, and I think we've got a great panel here to talk about both from the standpoint of an academician as well as to very experienced practitioners, how they think about organizational culture, shaping organizational culture, and trying to avoid the types of compliance issues that we've spoken about today. We only have 40 minutes for this panel, so I will introduce our group quickly, and then I think we'll dive right in. We have a terrific panel. To my right is Tatsu Inatani, who many of you probably know is a professor of law at Kyoto University with a specialty in criminology, corporate crime, deferred prosecution agreements. He also serves in an advisory capacity to METI, one of the most important Japanese regulators with respect to governance issues. Next is Pat Murphy, who's a senior vice president for legal at Fresenius Medical Care. He's had a very long career with a number of senior roles with respect to compliance in legal matters. He's also recently gone through the experience of a non-prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice. He spent many years as chief litigation counsel for GE Healthcare, one of the preeminent medical device companies in the world, and also has extensive government service, both with the FBI and starting with the United States Marine Corps, which I guess is an institution with a very strong culture that's very intentional about shaping the culture.
Whether you want it or not.
Yeah. And then finally is John Davidson, who's now a senior advisor at Precipia Advisory, which is an organizational advisor on organizational ethics. But he's also served as CEO of the Options Clearing Corporation, which, for those who don't know, is the world's largest equity derivatives clearing organization. He's also served, among other roles, as chief compliance officer at Citigroup, obviously one of the largest financial services companies in the world. So we're delighted to have all three panelists with us today. And maybe I'll start by asking Patrick, how do you think about and define and understand organizational context, culture in the context of your own company?
Yeah, and thank you all for having me here, and thanks for the question, Mark. I think to try to clearly define this is nearly impossible. I came from a culture at General Electric, I was there for about 20 years, where compliance was just woven into the fabric of our business. It was part of everything that we did. And so that was kind of my expectation of what companies did. I just sort of assumed that compliance, it wasn't a subordinate function, it was just a part of the company. I came to Fresenius Medical Care in 2018 when they were winding up or trying to wind up a rather contentious enforcement proceeding with the Department of Justice and the SEC. That resulted in our paying fines and penalties and disgorgement of about $231 million, and we received a 3-year independent monitorship. Which was a lot of fun during COVID, let me tell you, having to figure out how to handle travel to various places. But I think what's critical is to try to answer Mark's question, is to contrast my experience at GE with what I encountered when I first came to Fresenius. Because when I came to Fresenius, what I found, and just very quickly, it's a German healthcare company very focused on dialysis, kidney disease. So hopefully none of you know of them, and you'll never know of them. But that said, it's a large company. It's 120,000 employees in 85 countries. But when I got there, what I found is a culture that basically didn't have a compliance program. Okay, they had just appointed a chief compliance officer to try to show the Department of Justice and the SEC that we were doing the right things. But our compliance program consisted of a website and a bunch of policies on a website. And so I tried to understand, okay, what is it we need to do with this company? And to the question that Mark asked, to try to understand the culture of the company, first you have to understand how the business operates. All right, we are heavily dependent on third-party intermediaries. That's both for our sales intermediaries, but also our reliance on healthcare professionals, who we do a lot of work with. We also, though, had a culture. When we talk about culture, it cannot just be company culture. You have to look at national culture. And I thought the discussion a little bit earlier today was quite interesting. We were talking about the difference between Eastern and Western culture. Because I wish it was that simple. All right, because it's not. Western culture is really, and so is Eastern culture, it's a series of microcultures. So in a German company, what do we have? We have very hierarchical, very directional. And that was what I knew we had to contend with right up front, is how do I help the company to reorient itself so we're all thinking the same way in a culture that is focused not just on compliance, but a culture that kind of embraces compliance as a business facilitator. And I think for purposes of now, I'll stop, because I know we're going to get in later into how you go about doing that.
Okay. And John, you're an advisor now to companies. You've obviously sat as a chief compliance officer in a large company. You now advise other companies. How do you kind of define organizational culture?
Well, I'm a University of Chicago guy, so I like to go back to Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz talks about culture and organizational culture as a system of conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which organizations communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards business processes. Geertz writes, quote, "The function of culture is to impose meaning on the world and make it understandable," close quote. So if you think about that in the context of some of the things we've been talking about today, a Japanese view of the world, a German view of the world, an American view of the world are distinctly different. And the experiences people have growing up in those worlds, which are now very much commingled because of technology, so this is a constant dynamic, is something that is important to understand. And I do think that it's more, as you were saying, than just countries. There are microcultures. Allegedly, we're all interested in the Tech 7. Let's take 3 of them. Let's take Facebook, now Meta. Let's take Twitter, now X. Let's take Google, now Alphabet. Does anybody think they have identical cultures? If you do, you've never been anywhere near them or their products. They have very distinct cultures. And I think the important thing for companies to recognize is you can't just think that the culture is going to come with the environment in which you are embedded. The important thing is you need to build a culture for your organization, and you need to have the ability to modify that culture as society, as your business, and things of that nature change. And I think that's very important characteristics. I would say a culture of compliance sets the expectations that conduct across all the levels in the organization embeds compliance and conformance with not only the laws and the regulations, but those articulated values into every single business activity. That's what we're talking about, a culture of compliance.
And I'd like to
follow up in a minute about the point you've made, John, about how to change culture and to build culture. But before we get there, perhaps Tatsu, you could offer some reflections from an academic perspective on any recent developments.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'd like to express my So first of all, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to the Embassy of Japan and Professor Fukamizu for providing this opportunity. And please forgive me for using slides to answer the maths question because as my explanation is rather complicated. And please give me the authority to share the slides. So sorry, I can't share by myself. Yeah. Okay. So the title is the session's name, but in fact the content focuses more on the psychological matters related to the culture and cultural differences you guys mentioned. So the first, I'd like to offer some thoughts on what culture is from the perspective of dynamic game theory. Actually, the result is very similar to the Patrick Jones' understanding of culture in the end. So there is a famous anecdote about hunting by Janjuku Oso. It is a story about how two hunters can get a deer if they work together, but only one can get a rabbit if they work alone. The columns on the downside. And this story is about self-executing rules or the self-executing norms that is actually working as a culture, which is actually constrains the people's behavior. So once the hunters starting hunting deer, they won't stop. And if they start hunting rabbits, they'll keep going. Because it is the best option for each situation. We need no enforcement mechanisms to keep their behaviors in these cases. In other words, people's actions are determined by their beliefs about what is the best response in a given situation. From this perspective, we can think of the culture as a bundle of tangible and intangible signals that tells us what the best option is in a given situation. When people are placed in an environment with such a bundle of signals, it is obvious that they will act accordingly. Culture thus constrains people's behavior, working as their focal point. If behavior constrained by culture leads to behavior that is in line with law, then the problem is simple. We just need to strengthen the signals. However, we often encounter situations where undesirable corporate culture constrains people's behavior in a desired way. In order to solve these problems, maybe we later dig into these problems more, it is helpful to refer to the cognitive science findings on how people process information to change their behavior or understanding the world. So let's now consider some cognitive science findings. First, let's briefly explain the well-known dual process theory. So there are two systems involved in human information processing. A first and bottom-up system 1 relates to intuition and emotion, and a slow and top-down system 2 relates to deliberation, calculation, and logic. So system 1 is always functioning and automatically, so we can't stop system 1. The system 2 will not be activated properly unless you consciously pay attention to it. When system 1 faces a difficulty, system 2 is activated and a conscious decision is made. System 1 tends to automatically interpret things so that it can respond consistently, as it dislikes contradictions and then seek approval of system 2. If there is one thing to be careful of, it is that the relationship between system 1 and system 2 is not static. It is very similar to the cultural change. So the system 1 learns through a statistical learning to create patterns of situation, and system 2 calibration is carried out to enable more situation-appropriate responses by system 1. So there is a dynamic relationship between system 1 and system 2. Now let's take the famous trolley problem as an example to explain how system 1 and system 2 work. Case 1 is a typical trolley problem. In this case, 5 people are saved at the expense of one person's life by changing the direction of the runaway train using a switch. This case does not cause emotional disturbance to many people. In other words, your system 1 is not activated, and you can perform the utilitarian calculation of system 2 without difficulties. However, even in cases where you sacrifice one person to save 5, there is a difference in your brain when that sacrifice is brought about pushing the fat man onto the tracks with your own hands to stop the train. Many people, I hope, many people feel an emotional disturbance in this case. In other words, your system 1 is activated. Now, I'd like to explain about culture. It is known that there are cultural differences in both system 1 and system 2. it has been pointed out that there are two main cultural spheres. It is called the mind cultural sphere and hours cultural sphere, which respond emotionally in different ways. In the mind culture, it is mainly US, Canada, and so-called, I'm sorry, it's too generalized one, but Western European countries. Emotions are intuitively understood and put into practices as it is originating from within oneself. It is very individualistic view, right? Whereas in the hours culture, this is actually except the mind culture, emotions are intuitively understood and put into practice as existing within the relationship that surrounding human beings. The mind culture tries to interpret the person in the center of the picture. You can see the picture. Maybe the person from the mind culture understands that the person who is in the middle is happy. But from the hours culture, that is different. Many people answer that the person should be unhappy. So the understanding is different because most of the hours cultures people not only focuses on the central figure, but also try to understand relationship, which is how to say formed among the people. So that is a difference actually. In the mind sphere, people intuitively understand causality and responsibility attribution analytically. And in the hours sphere, they intuitively understand them holistically. So there is another difference, actually. As an example of this, in Islamic criminal law, which is part of the hours cultural sphere, there is no distinction between negligence and intent. It is very interesting. Because most of the mind's culture, intentional murder and negligence is strictly divided. And interestingly, in Japan too, there is a strong, only academic argument that the original form of crime is negligence. So these arguments are consistent with ethical institution of the hours culture sphere, that is system 1, because these things are related to emotion and understanding of intuitive understanding of the world. Then next, let's look to the cultural difference in system 2. It is very interesting because people from the mind cultural sphere tend to make utilitarian judgment more easily, like Bentham. So the people in the UK or the US is very familiar with the utilitarian judgment. Actually, people from the German is a bit different because they are actually in the middle. So they don't like the utilitarian judgment, but they are still individualistic. So these are very interesting, how to say, the graduation between the hours and minds. But anyway, so let's move on to other points. So people from the hours culture sphere tend to find it difficult to make utilitarian judgment in the first place. They tend to use system 2 logic to justify the consistency of their actions and decisions to reach more universal cause of conduct, like Kant. So in this regard, I use the discussion with Islamic law and the Japanese negligence theory as an example. Based on these differences, the following can be said. It is thought that it's relatively easy and effective to cause behavioral changes in people from the mind culture sphere by appealing to their utilitarian judgment. That is, incentives are very important for getting people to obey the rules. So the rate of detection and the amount of sanction are crucial to prevent the wrongdoings in these culture spheres. It may be relatively challenging to encourage behavioral change in people from the hours culture sphere based on utilitarian calculation, acting in one's own interest in contrast to intuitive and emotional decisions nurtured through relationships with people close to you, and in the context of corporate culture. It is often betraying their colleagues and reporting their wrongdoings may cause them to feel a strong sense of discomfort, like the case of the trolley programs, right? So this may also explain the fact that in many cases, even in US, I think, this is, the subculture maybe, for the ordinary employment. So this may also explain the fact in many cases, it is mentioned in maybe session 3 or 4, so that many employees prioritize internal reporting rather than external whistleblowing, perhaps. And in order to modify their intuitive and emotional judgment, it is necessary to work to change their beliefs correctly through means such as sending messages from authoritative figures, and actually changing their daily practices correctly. On the other hand, in our culture, once the emotional and intuitive judgments are in line with law, the rate of detection and the amount of sanctions are not particularly important, and it is more important to strengthen the ethical intuition through blame on violation of the law. So the retribution is very important in this culture. So this may be a factor that explains the low rates of street crime in Japan, perhaps, because there is not so huge difference between the detection rates between Japan and US. And maybe the sanction is lower in Japan, but still the street crime rate is very low. So I think these things are very interesting, maybe example how these kind of things goes differently. But anyway, so finally, I'm sorry, I consumed the time. So finally, I give a brief conclusion. So given the recent findings of cognitive science, it can be said that encouraging behavior change based on how people use their respective system 1 and system 2 is important for establishing new behavior and thinking patterns and realizing a desirable corporate culture. And the differences between the mind culture sphere and our culture spheres are merely general trends, and it is extremely important to focus on the actual situation in which people find themselves. So we should focus more on the actual situation and actual understanding of the employees or the managers or something like that, right? And the management, and the management who are always conscious of the market and profits tend to be easily influenced by utilitarian calculation. So it is important to have incentive structure that works on their utilitarian calculations. And on the other hand, for ordinary employees, especially those from our culture, appealing to their utilitarian calculation may have the opposite effect because it hurts their system 1 and maybe complete their system of beliefs. That is unintended consequences. But anyway, rather it is more important to make efforts within the company to align their ethical intuition with the law. That's all, so thank you for listening. It's so long explanation, but from now on, I'd like to build on what I've said so far. So thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds like one takeaway from several of the comments thus far is sort of the individualized nature of particular companies and particular cultures within those companies, and sort of the fact that one size does not necessarily, fit all among types of employees, among types of companies, among types of different geographies. Pat, you mentioned that when you came to Fresenius, there was really no compliance program. How did you kind of go about building a kind of culture of compliance from that environment? I mean, I guess with the absence of a compliance program, that doesn't mean there isn't a compliance culture. It may not be one that you want, but perhaps you could.
Yeah. So the challenge when I came to Fresenius is that it was a company that was actually a bunch of little companies. It had been pulled together by a bunch of acquisitions, but the acquisitions had never been integrated. So the first challenge, listen, the only thing that the headquarters really did at that time, I shouldn't say only thing, but the primary thing was that it consolidated earnings and it made sure that we got the reports out to the necessary authorities. So the first number one challenge that I saw is that I had to get buy-in from senior management. And it's interesting, when I was listening to a lot of the enforcement folks up here today, everything had kind of a negative tilt to it. And I don't think the way that you get management, senior management, on board is by threatening them. I think the way you get senior management on board is to show them that it's their interest to build compliance into their culture. And so the hesitancy I had with doing that at Fresenius was that unlike GE, where I think this might go kind of to system 1 you described, is GE is you tried something, you failed fast at it, if it didn't work, you pivoted. So you try something else, okay? Whereas at Fresenius, it's a very sort of collective judgment process, I think more along the system 2. So the first thing I had to do is to get our board to buy in completely to what we were doing and to show them why it's in their interest to do it. Very easy to say, very challenging to do, especially when you have a history of not really thinking of these matters. So, you know, I did that through several ways, but most importantly, it was to drive how tone from the top is going to help us get through this monitorship. That was point one. And I said, well, whether you buy into it or not right now, if we can get through the monitorship, then we will have achieved, you know, a very critical goal of getting certified as having an effective compliance program. But in order to do that, that tone from the top has to be legitimate, and the government has to see it. Because remember, when you're in a monitorship, you take your CEO, you take your board members into DOJ, into the SEC. They speak directly to them, and that gave them a real reality check of what it is that they would be facing and how the importance of compliance could come through. Second point, you had to empower the people that were in the functions. When I first came to Fresenius, it's a room very much like this. I brought them into our boardroom in Bad Homburg, Germany. And I had finance, HR, employment, legal, you know, the audit team. And I realized nobody knew each other. They didn't even know each other. So how are you going to collaborate and develop a system of compliance, just a culture of compliance, if you don't even know each other? So that was point one. And so from there, we had to build. I had our CEO regularly meet with our monitor, and then regular updates to the board. But importantly, I empowered our CEO, or I instructed our CEO that it's totally in our interest to message to the team, this isn't just something we have to get through. This isn't something that's important for the entire company, and it's actually going to make us better. And I'll stop with one critical reason why. At least, I think there's sort of outside counsel sort of have this attitude a lot of times that all the people acting in companies are just, you know, a lot of them are doing bad things, are inherently corrupt. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of times they really don't know. They don't know that what they're doing is wrong. When they go and talk to a tendering authority, you know, that's what's always been done in that community. They don't know that there are certain times when you're allowed to talk to a tendering authority. They just didn't know. So we tried to get our leadership to tell them that, listen, we're behind you. If you have problems, we need you to come forward. This, I hate to use the term, but it's a real one. This is a safe space. So come forward. Because I would say, you know, again, the last point I'll make, we've been talking a lot about whistleblowing. And you know, when you have a problem, how do you incentivize employees to come forward? I actually think that's the wrong calculus when you're trying to build a compliance program. I think the right calculus is you have to empower employees to ask why. You know, why are we giving these 40% commissions? Why are we giving these massive discounts? Why are we sending these healthcare professionals on lavish trips? Why are we funding research that has no deliverables? You know, but they have to feel safe in asking why. And when you come from a hierarchical kind of, I hate to use the term again, dictatorial environment, they're not used to raising their hand, just saying, hey, that doesn't look right to me. You don't need to whistleblow about it. You just have to say, that doesn't look right. What can we do about it? Is this wrong? And if you incentivize employees to ask why, and there's lots of ways you can do that, I think that's the start to building the culture and changing the culture within a company. And that's what we tried to do.
Right. One sort of thing that's always struck me very powerfully in the like social psychology literature is just how these very subtle sort of social cues when you come into a new organization can affect, to your point, kind of employees' perceptions of like what is permissible behavior and what is impermissible behavior in a way that people very often grossly underestimate. And obviously, like one way to cue those things is the tone from the top point that you mentioned. John, how do you think particularly, you know, there's the tone from the top, how do you think about kind of the role of middle management in this whole discussion?
Well, I think middle management are really key in having a healthy corporate culture. You can think of them as the transmission vehicle between that tone from the top and the echo from the bottom. And you don't have a compliant organization unless the tone from the top meets an echo from the bottom. the middle managers need to be fully conversant, and they have to be bought in to the corporate social value proposition and the need to do these things. They are the ones that are going to translate that high-level theory that at some level was made for the equity analysts and the shareholders and all those wonderful folks into something that a person, if you will, at the coalface actually needs to confront every single day. As you mentioned in the introduction, I was CEO of the Options Clearing Corporation essentially for 5 years. Every month we had a all-hands meeting. Every month I would say we have an open door policy. If you have concerns, please come and see me. About 1,000 people in 3 different locations in our case. 2 people in the course of 5 years came and knocked on the door. Because I was a middle manager early in my career, managed by walking around. So during the normal times, I would go and sit at people's workstations and talk to them. And I think that face-to-face communication, which would happen once, when I had some spare time in my schedule in my case, but a middle manager is doing that every single day and interacting with the people that work for her. And there's where the opportunity for employees to raise things that look just a little out of the ordinary, and then the middle manager can explain the context of why that thing that looked a little out of the ordinary is actually important. But the interesting thing about the pandemic is a lot of that goes away because it works best when there's face-to-face human interaction. And so again, in the pandemic, because we had everybody working remotely, we had twice a week all hands meetings just so people could feel that they knew what was going on. And every single one of those I would say, give me a call or let's have a Zoom and I'll be happy to hear what your concerns are. 0 people who would be happy to sit down with me at the coffee machine or meet me in the hall or see me walking around and pull me aside. Not a breath of interest because all the formality associated, I've got to find his phone number, I've got to get on his schedule, all these more formal things that happen when your communication is not face-to-face. But then, of course, if you're a big corporation, 250,000 people, I think, survived the cutbacks at Citi in 100 and some different jurisdictions. That's much harder to do, which again is why you need those middle managers, because the middle manager is the person that's in the country, in the office, and they're the ones that are really, if you will, the culture carriers, not the folks at the top turnover.
Patrick, what was
the way I put it is that the folks at top set the standard. The middle managers are the ones who execute on the vision. And it's very well said.
And how do you think, either of you, about the question of there's sort of middle managers, and then a lot of these organizations have a lot of hiring of new people to the organization. I mean, John, you described kind of the big tech companies and how they have very divergent and different cultures. Many of them are probably hiring the same candidates who are, weighing options between 2 of them, and they choose one and they become kind of a part of that culture, whereas if they picked the other firm, they would have become part of that. I mean, how do you think about sort of the, indoctrination, transmission of culture in a way that's healthy and good and reinforcing kind of values, particularly in this situation where, the norm of coming to the office is a lot reduced?
Yeah, and I think those are serious challenges, and obviously, some of the formal part is very important. Yes, you can't tell the DOJ that 99% of our people took the training. A more interesting question is, how many took the training only after the deadline passed, right? That tells you something about their willingness and interest in being trained and their level of buy-in. I think a lot of it is just assimilation. that you have to have people who are well respected in the organization, and they carry with them, in addition to their technical knowledge about the sort of institutional knowledge of the organization. I remember when I worked for Morgan Stanley in Japan, when you had to make a Gopen Nasai visit to apologize for something you screwed up, you always wanted a gray-haired person to do that. So I guess now I could do that, but at the time, I ran operations, didn't have any gray hair, so I had no credibility in that culture in going and apologize. And I think every company needs to sort of figure out, and in some cases it's, it varies by location, who are those people that don't necessarily have a position in the hierarchy that's formal, but they are the informal people that can really transmit the characteristics of the culture and the things that are important.
Okay. So
Why don't you go ahead, Pat, and then touch.
Okay. So just one quick thought on that. The best I've ever seen, or maybe the right word is the most extreme I've ever seen, is a company called Danaher Corporation. They are disciplined followers of the Toyota business model. And the day you walk in the door there, Kaizen is just a way of life. And what they do with their executives, the first 2 months they come to the corporation, those executives go and they work on the shop floor to understand the culture of following the Toyota business process and how that fits into literally everything they do in their business that is integrated in that. I think that's the best example I've ever seen. GE had kind of a very light version of that, but if you really want to incentivize your company to change culture, they're a great model to follow, in my opinion.
So I completely echo with your opinions, actually. So from my viewpoint, so culture is a collective belief. And so any divisions in the company may hinder their cultivate a good culture, actually. And so from that viewpoint, so sectionalism is actually the most, worst thing to avoid, for example. And the middle manager is actually, as you mentioned, connecting the top manager's message, connecting the top manager's message to their ordinary employees. And I've seen many times that the top message is too abstract. And maybe these people are too intelligent, actually. So their message is too abstract, too, idealistic, and very difficult to understand for the ordinary workers. And so the middle manager's the role is very important to translate these words more understandable one. And which is actually make the book, the compliance of the book, make compliance of the book into the practice of compliance. If I see from the viewpoint of compliance, but more important thing is to embody the value, core values, or the core purpose of the corporation, which is the main, the driver for the corporation. I think the compliance is also the important things, but which should be integrated into these more, core value or something like that, which actually incentivize in terms of the Western culture, incentivize ordinary employees, and actually internally motivates the ordinary employees in the Eastern culture. So that is the sort of thing. Yeah, thank you.
So I think we have about 5 minutes. If there are questions, we can take those, or we can continue. Here.
Hi, I'm Tarek here from PwC. So I've been coaching a lot of management and middle management and junior staff members on a compliance matter, on a mindset, culture, that sort of things, and motivation is one of the things, and incentivizing is another thing. And I think in Japan, recently I'm noticing a lot of management started realizing the importance of the middle management role and sort of enforcing the culture and that sort of thing. So what you say is 100%, I agree. What I've noticed though, at the same time, in a lot of cases, I don't know if it's the Japan problem or the other problems, but when you look at the employment survey, the middle management has the lowest satisfaction rate in terms of the workload, the cultures, and the overburdened workload coming from the top, and added pressure to sort of, play a role of, being a middleman between the top management and junior staff members. How would you, from the motivation standpoint and incentive standpoint, how would we effectively kind of implement that sort of middle management expectations and roles within the organizations?
I think that's a very interesting challenge. It's completely understandable that they do have the lowest level of satisfaction. They have the most things heaped on them in addition to whatever the work is. And all of that is something that doesn't necessarily get recognized or compensated either financially or otherwise. I think one of the things that's important, and we had some not so positive things to say about human resources earlier on in the conference, but one of the things I think is particularly important is how performance evaluations are done. Because managers have to do all those performance evaluations and somehow fit that into the workload of everything else. A lot of companies, particularly publicly traded companies, companies owned by private equity firms, focus on what was accomplished during whatever the evaluation period is. So some 90+% of the evaluation is the what. I think a much better way of doing that in building a corporate culture is at least 50% of the evaluation ought to be the how. How did you go about what it was that you accomplished? How did you interact with your colleagues and your peers and your subordinates? And give a little more recognition that those non-specific revenue generating things that take up all sorts of time in the middle manager's schedule, which is in their minds then taking away from the what. Right? If I fill out all these silly forms and go to all these trainings and I'm just not producing the revenue, or I'm not enabling the producing. There needs to be it doesn't necessarily have to change the incentive or the compensation structure at all, but it does make clear what the criteria for success are. Can't just accomplish wonderful revenue or wonderful productivity or whatever the measure is. It's the way you do it that matters at least as much as what you've actually done.
Yeah, just one additional comment to that. I think a lot of times middle management, they hate their current situation because they're getting it from both directions, right? And so I think one critical thing, at least in my experience, and I know everyone's had their own experiences, that is extremely helpful day to day is empowering them. And let me give you an example. During the monitorship, we had probably 75 different work streams going on. And I had a team of over 100 people working on it. I would empower certain people, I'm saying I do it perfectly, but I empowered certain people to be responsible for certain work streams. I wasn't going to micromanage it, I just needed the deliverable from them. So, who's in charge of third-party due diligence? That is yours. You own that work stream, go execute however it's done. It's kind of the concept of intent-based leadership, I think, where the leader says what they want to get done, and then they rely on the professionalism and the execution of their subordinates to do it. But if you do that with middle management and they feel empowered, I think it really goes a long way to satisfying their satisfaction with their work.
I think so actually I think
your question is very interesting because in 1970s or in 1980s, Japanese middle management, very motivated middle managers, they played a very important role for Japanese companies' economic success, actually. And at that time, actually, they are more empowered. So we can find many examples. They're more empowered, more recognized middle managers still playing their important role in Japanese companies like Honda Jet examples or some other important issues, some other very perhaps impressive examples in Japanese companies. So we can pick up from the history and now going on. So many examples which actually successfully motivates the middle managers by the recognition or the empowerment or something like that. So I think we can find many examples from our own history. That is my answer. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think we are out of time, so let's thank the panelists for a great discussion.